Hello, everybody. Eric Foster, co-founder of the Future Today and Tomorrow Super PAC. We just had a major ruling in the Supreme Court case of Louisiana v. Callais. Now, that case was ruling on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and a particular section, Section 2, which dealt with redistricting and utilizing the Voting Rights Act to ensure that minority communities who were making up majorities in areas of a state would have the ability to elect representatives of their choice who looked like them and came from their backgrounds. The MAGA majority on the Supreme Court today said that racial gerrymandering to counter racial gerrymandering against minority communities is illegal. So the corrective action to create majority white or to create majority MAGA or Republican districts, in spite of large minority populations who don't typically vote for those candidates, that the remedy is unconstitutional and that there's this narrow test of when you might be able to use it, which is basically something that you're not going to be able to reach. And so, to that particular point, basically, they have the MAGA majority has finished off killing the Voting Rights Act. Now, in this point, we at the Future Today and Tomorrow are encouraging you to engage us because we have an action plan of how do you respond. The problems that exist are still opportunities for response, for ensuring how do we make sure that there's still representation for communities of color around the country, and how do we strengthen and balance against the insidious growth of the MAGA right wing agenda, which is to take away from our communities. So here's where we start first. So, right now, because of that decision, Black Voters Matter and other groups have studied this and written reports, Brennan Center and others, on the likelihood that you would have hundreds of seats that are majority African American, majority minority, with the minority. There's no one that's over 50%, but it is a minority in totality. That's over 50% of the population. Majority Hispanic districts dropping at significant numbers in southern states. The states in target: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, along with the potential loss of 19 seats in Congress that are currently held by Democrats and currently held by majority minority individuals. So here's the problem. One, well, here's the action plan. So, step one, there's a need to start to build what worst case scenario maps legislatively and congressionally would look like under this ruling. Because ultimately, the ability to respond in spite of the ruling is going to include understanding what is the worst case scenario in these states. Now, based on what that worst case scenario is in these states, you also want to look at where are the voting opportunities. Because one of the things that we found in our analysis of especially MAGA controlled states is that voting participation in primaries and general elections is significantly lower than in majority Democratic voting states or so-called blue states when it comes to congressional and legislative races. So you have a significant majority population who's not voting in these particular races. That means that, let's say, I'll give you a good example. When Colin Allred ran for, when Colin Allred ran for no, it wasn't Colin Allred. It was in 2018 in the Texas Senate race between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Rafael Eduardo Cruz. I'm gonna call him by his birth name, not his made up name. The collective vote turnout for Rafael versus Beto only represented 31% of the total eligible voting population in the state of Texas. 69% of the potential eligible voters who could have voted did not participate. And that race was a very close race. Now, imagine if there was a focus to get that number from 31% to 50%, with an extra 19% of the eligible electorate participating. The opportunity to swing that race from a tight MAGA Republican victory to a significantly sizable Democratic victory really lays in growing that number of participation. It's kind of similar to the jobs market. You know, one of the things that tells you have a strong economy is the more people who are eligible to work who are in the labor force, either working full time, part time, or looking for a job, even if they're not working, versus those who are not in the labor force. When the not in the labor force continues to grow, that means that you have a serious disconnect in your economic fortunes. But when you have higher participation, that means that there's greater opportunity that's being spread around to diverse populations. Well, it's the same thing in voting. So, in analyzing the worst case scenario of the congressional and legislative districts, and we're going to say also look at your county commission districts, however they're called, be if it's commission or judges or supervisors or the like. Also look at your municipal districts, look at your school districts, if there are boundaries for your school board electeds, and if they're elected under a partisan banner, any other interjurisdictional governmental agencies that you vote for, like Public Safety Commission or judicial, et cetera, where there's a partisan nature to it. Draw the worst case scenario maps and then look at from a socioeconomic and a racial, ethnic, and ancestry demographic standpoint, how many people are still eligible to vote and not voting? Because in those cases, if the race is less than a plus 20 MAGA, that's where you have an opportunity by increasing the participation rate from those who are eligible and don't participate, where you can make those races flip in spite of what the MAGA Republicans want to have happen. So that's the first step. The second step is strategic relocation of voting and voters and their power from these particular states to blue states. So there's going to be a need over the next few years to really dive into a marketing campaign to try to migrate African American, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous American, Jewish, Arab, Pacific Hawaii, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander American voters away from these particular states, not just in the South, but also in the Central Plains and the Mountain West, to friendly states where you have the ability to grow the numbers of non-MAGA voters in these states with redistricting coming up in 2030 and census apportionment coming up. Increasing those numbers stems the tide of growth in states like Texas and others, and increases the likelihood that you will have people who will be able to come from California or New York or Minnesota or Michigan or other states that are pro democracy, pro multicultural, multiracial, multi gender society, expansion of social and civil liberties, Americans, against the backdrop of this stuff from the MAGA side. And I want to say this also kind of as a side, because while this is going on, Drunk Pete, the defense secretary, is testifying in Congress. And he's made it very clear that, in his opinion, Democratic members, Democratic voting Americans, non MAGA Americans are anti American because we're asking questions, not believing the lies that come from Drunk Pete, Donald Trump, and others. And we are wondering, why are we in this war and how do we get out, and why do you need 1.5 trillion in the military budget when, with all the money we've spent since President Bush, we're running out of weapons? So if you think you can work with these people, you can, because nothing you do, unless you give them 100% loyalty, is going to have them recognize you as a valid, legitimate American citizen. Okay, so that's the reality. Accept it. Let's move on. So, like I say, strategic migration, getting people, the African American population in Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Missouri, the Hispanic population in Texas, and the indigenous American population in Oklahoma, getting these populations, or Oklahoma and Montana and other places, getting these populations to move to these friendly states, or even move to states where there's opportunities to potentially congregate and flip. So, for example, Montana has potential because it has voted for Democrats at a statewide level. It has, and you've seen an increase in the number of legislative members that are Democrats in Montana in 2024. There are strategic ways to grow new states like that, where you can, with having people move from the Dakotas, Idaho, Wyoming, and others that are Democratic voters, and minority communities, and white voters who vote for Democrats, to move into a Montana, to flip that state, but also move and grow the number for representation in California. So you reverse the trend of going down and you start growing the number of seats coming out of California, out of Michigan, out of Wisconsin, out of Minnesota, out of Illinois, out of New York and Maryland and other states, to balance what's happening in these red states. Because if we're going to lose 19 congressional seats over the next year from these particular states, the populations who are being disenfranchised, the second step, after trying to figure out other ways to try to minimize that loss, by engaging the non-voting eligible population is to get those populations to move out of those states and move into blue states or into states that you can swing. Two states in the South that I would also look at in addition to Montana, I would suggest Georgia and North Carolina. Virginia is a blue state, and we want to keep it blue, so there needs to be some migration there. But Georgia and North Carolina have significant blue tendencies, and population migration from Florida, from Alabama, from Arkansas, from Louisiana, from Tennessee into these two states can give us the tipping point to swing those states to truly be blue states. So you take those states, you take Montana, and now what you've done is you potentially get those three to be consistently blue voting states. You also build on the numbers in Nevada. You build on Arizona with Hispanic, Asian American, and other and Indigenous American populations moving from places like Oklahoma and Nebraska and others to those states. So you not only grow congressional numbers, but you also grow the reliance of those states voting for Democrats in presidential elections. And now you've balanced out the problem that we're facing. Ultimately, though, these strategies take planning, they take marketing, they take messaging, they take responses to what the other side is going to say about you advocating and pushing in these ways. And they take the ability to execute, understanding that voters, parents, people in making their residential choices are consumers. And you have to sell them and move them through the buying process to accept this approach. And so when I look at what happened today, we at the Future Today and Tomorrow Super PAC see an opportunity. We don't see this as the end of the world. We see this as a strategic imperative to move our political fortunes in certain ways. Starting now, understanding implications in 2026, and how do we mitigate and stem the tide in 2026 with a lens of thinking towards 2030 and reapportionment, and how do we get those 38% who vote Democratic in Oklahoma, or that 40% who vote Democratic, or 42% who vote Democratic in Nebraska, or that 35% who vote for Democrats in the Dakotas. How do we shift them over to places where we can make a significant impact, where we can start to change the electoral outcomes, where we can grow firewalls against the pro dictatorship take and position of the MAGA influence in America? It takes being pragmatic, it takes understanding the challenge and the landscape that we face, and it takes the willingness to fight back proactively, economically, and politically. That's the resolute stature that we at the Future Today and Tomorrow Super PAC have and believe is critical in fighting this battle. If you want to support us, not only would I suggest visiting our website or contacting me at, well, Super PAC email is down, but contact me at ericcfoster44@gmail.com. But additionally, collaborate with us. Let's set up some time to meet. If you're with different organizations in the Democratic and Pro Democracy Coalition, we want to engage and work with you. We think we have a game plan of how do we map out a response to this decision that's tangible and that can sustain us going forward. And we want to work and be a part of the coalition that gets us there. So let's talk, let's engage, and let's get into this fight together. Let's win this fight together, and let's turn this around because I am tired of us being on our back foot. Let's get on our front foot and let's start pressing our advantages strategically. So, thank you again. Please follow us on social media and please reach out to me if you have any other questions. You can also reach me at eric@bankscompany.us. But let's get out here and let's do this work together because ultimately, what happened today at the Supreme Court is wrong. It's not consistent with the law because here's the reality. When the 14th and 15th Amendments were being debated in Congress, race and the protection of race was an intentional factor in the congressional debate and in the record as the majority made their decisions on the various sections of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which fed into the Voting Rights Act, which also had race specific intentionality in the congressional debate. So all of this colorblind bullshit doesn't fit with the record of those who actually passed these constitutional amendments and statutory laws to address inequitable racial harm. But we have what we have. How do we win in spite of it? Let's win together. Thank you.